Hey folks, I'm brownbear. Today's the first in a 5-part design commentary series on competitive StarCraft II. I'll be talking about all sorts of different things, from balance and art style to matchmaking and community. At a high level, anything that comes to mind. For clarity's sake, anytime you hear the word StarCraft, I mean StarCraft II. If I'm referencing Brood War, I'll just call it Brood War. Finally, I recommend that you watch this video from beginning to end. However, for the convenience of folks who prefer to jump around, I've provided timestamps to major talking points in the description below. Before we get started, I'll give you an idea of where I'm coming from. My experience with real-time strategy games goes back to the original Age of Empires. I started playing online with Age of Empires 2, and started playing competitively in Age of Titans, eventually participating in the World Cyber Games in Age of Empires 3. I started playing StarCraft with the launch of Legacy of the Void and reached a Masters League on the China server within a few months. Soon after, I started writing about the game's design. Currently, I'm in Masters 3 in both 1v1 and 2v2 on the North American server. To be perfectly honest, I don't know where to start. I did a commentary series on Banjo-Kazooie, but that was pretty straightforward. Banjo is a single-player game, so I just played it from beginning to end. Where do you begin with a game like StarCraft II? Any kind of commentary like this one is going to have a personal, subjective element to it. After all, it's just me talking about the game's design for about 3 hours straight. I figured this video should start in the same place I would start after a long break from the game, doing my placements on the competitive ladder. While you're watching me get my ass kicked, I'll start off with a philosophical discussion of what game design is, and what differentiates the design of esports like StarCraft. Game designers leverage computer games to create and convey specific experiences. Games are unique because they're interactive. This allows the designer to create experiences that aren't as easy to achieve in a unidirectional medium like writing or film. Over the years, I've read a lot of different descriptions of this phenomenon, but for whatever reason, my favorite's always been the very first definition I ever read. Jesse Schell, in his book The Art of Game Design, describes the game designer's role as follows. And this is the paradox of experiences. On one level, they are shadowy and nebulous, and on another, they are all we know. But as tricky as experiences can be, creating them is all a game designer really cares about. Makes sense, right? A game designer builds a game to convey a specific experience, to accomplish a particular goal. In this way, games are not so different from other types of creative works. A game like Dark Souls is structured to convey a sense of accomplishment, Banjo-Kazooie a wide-eyed exploration adventure, even StarCraft's campaign, an epic space opera. But there's a way of reading this notion of experiences that belies a certain assumption about games development. The idea that the designer is responsible for creating an experience can imply that the experience is driven by the designer. In other words, the player is passively engaging with something the designer has constructed, rather than forging their own experience. This is fine, but it doesn't fully leverage the advantages of the medium. The player is a passive observer, like the audience in a movie theater. This is a little hard to explain, so let me use an example. Take the original Mass Effect. It's a very linear, single-player experience. Every moment in the game features the strong hand of a game designer. Every choice, every engagement. There are very few organic interactions in Mass Effect. Almost everything is a pre-configured set piece. Despite all this, I'd argue Mass Effect is a great example of how to leverage the computer gaming medium. The core narrative arc is very familiar, and one that's been done many times before. Harry Potter, The Lord of the Rings, and the Chronicles of Narnia, to name a few examples. Those books have even older roots, harkening back all the ways to the works of Homer. These types of stories tend to get told over and over across a variety of different societies because they reflect certain truths about the human condition. What makes Mass Effect unique is that it's a computer game. The player gets to actually be the paragon of moral virtue, or the renegade of chaos if they so choose. They're not just reading about it, they're living it. The interactive nature of the medium augments and enhances the experience. Now compare this with Mass Effect Andromeda, which attempts to modernize the Mass Effect formula by removing the binary Paragon and Renegade choices, and replacing them with vague feelings. On the surface, this seems smart. Most people found the binary system of the original to be too clunky and in your face. But the original system worked because it took advantage of the interactive nature of computer games to tell yet another rendition of the classic great story. Departure, struggle, and return, as it's sometimes described. Take this away, and the player becomes little more than a passive observer of meaningless choices. It's not a surprise that the new system was not well received by fans. The original Mass Effect is a wonderful example of a great traditional game. It uses content to drive a specific player experience, structuring that content in such a way as to fully utilize the interactive nature of the medium. The designer is present every step of the way, meticulously crafting and weaving together the different components in order to build a complete package. Competitive StarCraft works a little differently. It takes full advantage of being interactive, then goes a step further. Even the content itself isn't what drives the experience. When I say content, I mean things like new units or levels or worlds, new stuff that's enjoyable partly because it's new, and by extension less enjoyable when it's experienced a third or fourth or 10th time. Rather, the experience is driven by the player. The content is like an instrument that the player plays in order to produce something that they find compelling. For instance, the joy of splitting Marines against Banelings isn't tied to the content. It's not like a level you complete from beginning to end. You don't enjoy this interaction because you've never seen it before. In fact, the opposite is true. Competitive Terran players will do this over and over and over, thousands upon thousands of times. The expectation is that it'll continue to be fun, even after they've been doing it for years. It's not the content itself that's compelling, although that's important for other reasons. It's what the player brings to the table that makes it fun. It's the joy of executing better, the wonder of more deeply understanding an experience the 1000th time you do it, the satisfaction of repeating a well-worn technique to win an engagement, the quiet life lessons that emerge. The content stays the same, the experience does not. Most games just don't work this way. The idea of divorcing a game's content from its intended experience, seeing it as the instrument rather than the piece of music, can feel almost incomprehensible, particularly if your gaming experience is centered around modern AAA games. How can it be possible for someone to enjoy building units, or placing production buildings, or repeating the same build order for the 100th time? Do Terran players continue to enjoy the game in spite of having spent 7 years splitting against Banelings? Or do they enjoy the game because of it? I'd be remiss if I overgeneralized here, so I'll point out that not everyone who plays StarCraft plays competitively. In fact, about 80% of the overall player base clears the campaign and never engages with the multiplayer at all. But the focus of this series is the competitive side of the game, so that's what we're going to talk about. We'll dive with great depth into the player-driven nature of competitive StarCraft, and hopefully by the end you'll have a better appreciation of what makes this game so special. We lost a bunch of games in a row, so perhaps it'd be better if we worked on our builds. One of the keys to success in StarCraft lies within executing an optimized plan, much like many other real-time strategy games. A player that's proactively pursuing a goal has a significant advantage over one who's playing more reactively. The proactive player can arrange their decisions in an efficient way, and ultimately end up in the best place possible at any given time. At a high level you could call this a build order, although I'd go broader than that. Keeping a general plan in mind can help a player stay on track, even if their predetermined build is interrupted by a cheese, timing attack, or other surprise. This is a huge topic that we'll come back to again and again. The first thing we'll do is learn a few basic openers, and to do that we'll play some custom games. I've loaded up Huangsang here, a wonderful map by Avex, to practice a defensive macro build. Our goal is to execute this build over and over until we've memorized every single step. The idea is that whoever put this build together optimized it to achieve a specific goal. By copying their build order, we can achieve the same goal in an equally optimal way. That might sound straightforward, but there's a lot to unpack here. For now, let's start with execution. Practicing build orders is the equivalent of honing your craft, training yourself in preparation for competition. I think one of the most underappreciated aspects of the real-time strategy genre is the moment-to-moment pleasure of playing these games, of queuing up units, of placing down production buildings. StarCraft II does a wonderfully subtle job accenting and accentuating these simple actions without getting in the player's face. To illustrate this, let's take a closer look at the first couple minutes of Terran. I want you to pay attention to how the game feels. Not what's happening, but rather the raw sounds and images, the flow of data pouring into your mind. Right as the game begins, you hear the gentle hum of the command center. Smoke drifts outward as though it were freshly dropped from orbit. You feel calm, but you also feel primed. You feel ready to go. Your first rally point cuts a sharp line across your base. You hear a small vibration in the background.
SCV ready.
The minerals sparkle as you watch your SCVs gather some initial resources. It's almost unnoticeable, but you can hear their gears shift as they move to and fro.
SCV ready.
Your rallied SCV places a square on the map, small but distinct. The level of detail is superb. There's a line in each edge, a diamond in the middle, and an even smaller circle within that.
What's going on?
The green image of a supply depot shimmers on your screen. When you place it, you hear a distinct plop. There's a weight to it. It's even stronger for larger buildings, like your first barracks. All of these are little things, not particularly important, small details here and there. But when you put them all together, the effect on the gameplay experience is substantial. The game simply feels good to play. It feels like playing a labor of love. You get the sense that someone really went through it with a fine-tooth comb and actually tried to express, in gameplay terms, why rally points matter, why collecting resources is fun, why it feels good to build stuff. Let's watch that sequence again. This time, be like the Buddha. Clear your mind, and let the sounds and images flow through you.
SCV ready. What's going on? Yeah, whatever. SCV ready.
Pretty cool, right? Try the same exercise in the mid-game.
Need more energy.
SCV ready.
CC's up. You have not enough minerals. Money, 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 money.
This happens every time you play StarCraft. There's a reason it feels fun to play certain games for years and years, long after all the new content has dried up, long after you've seen everything you could possibly see. StarCraft II exemplifies that idea. On top of all this, learning build orders has a certain meditative and quietly satisfying quality to it. There's a joy that comes from slowly learning the ins and outs of an opener, seeing where it can diverge, identifying potential weaknesses. Each time you execute a build, it's a familiar and well-worn set of actions. It feels good. There's a famous quote from a professional tennis player, Arthur Ashe, who articulates this idea better than I can. You are never really playing an opponent. You are playing yourself, your own highest standards, and when you reach your limits, that is real joy. Beyond visceral enjoyment, it's worth discussing builds on a more strategic level. As you execute your build, what you're really doing is traversing a decision-making tree. You can't make every decision possible because you have limited resources. Furthermore, you're physically constrained from making infinite actions per second. A refined build order is an optimal traversal toward a specific point on the tree that's well suited toward accomplishing a goal. In order for a goal to make sense, it needs to take into account the other possible decision-making trees. For instance, an early game timing attack might rely on the idea that it'll hit right as an opponent's build leaves them vulnerable. Every pro executes builds like this, but for me I always think of Hero, the Protoss player. Conversely, a good build recognizes its own weaknesses relative to other decision trees. A key feature of Beyond's classic 2 medevac timing attack was the importance of the Scouting Reaper to detect if early game aggression was on its way. All of this sounds straightforward on paper, but even a cursory look at the number of possible builds demonstrates the overwhelming complexity. Balancing this is extraordinarily difficult, and that's where execution becomes important. The designer has a much easier job balancing the game if they can safely assume that builds are executed optimally. That way they can compare the optimal state of one race against the optimal state of another race, given two particular traversals of the tree, and make adjustments if they're needed. If they don't do this, then the game becomes impossible to balance effectively. The designer needs to consider every potential mistake and include it in their analysis. That's really hard. The number of inefficient ways of playing the game is always going to be much larger than the number of efficient ways. This is why it's so important to understand optimal build execution when playing StarCraft. The game, like many other traditional real-time strategy games, is designed and balanced around it. I think a huge amount of frustration stems from a failure to understand this, to assess one's path down the strategic decision-making tree and evaluate it fairly against one's opponent. Anytime you see a comment that says, all of a sudden they have X, or Y unit is just too strong at this point in the game, and it's not coming from a professional executing optimized builds, odds are that the complaining player hasn't carefully examined their decision tree and compared it against their opponents. It's likely that their opponent simply traversed the tree better than they did. The beauty of StarCraft's design is that this is not binary. The game's mechanical design enables a vast spectrum of mechanical outcomes. It's easy enough that players can do a lot of things out of the box, yet hard enough to enable continuous and uncapped improvement, even at the professional level. This frees players to think in terms of the quality of their traversal, rather than viewing it as correct or incorrect. It's challenging to use concrete examples and have this video still be relevant more than a couple months from now, but I think Adept Phoenix against Terran is a good example of the necessity of understanding decision trees, and hopefully one that people years from now will be able to comprehend. Even high-level professionals have joked about uninstalling the game over this unit composition. The reason for this frustration is easy to see. Terran players like to play aggressively against Protoss in the early to mid-game, and Adept Phoenix counters that. Recognizing the right response requires an understanding of the two players' decision trees. The Protoss' heavy commitment in the mid-game creates an opportunity for the Terran player to play defensively and aim to win in the late game. Both a wonderful article on Terrancraft and a wonderful piece by Artosis spell this out explicitly. If you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend you check them out. The links are in the description below. Now that you've seen me execute this build, let's watch a replay of a professional. The replay system in StarCraft II is the most sophisticated and high-quality implementation I've ever seen in a real-time strategy game. From the lowest level nuts and bolts, all the way to the niceties of the user interface, the attention to detail is unbelievable. Let me start by explaining at a high level how online play works in real-time strategy. Most RTS games use a network architecture called lockstep simulation. This means that every player in a match simultaneously simulates the entire game on their local machine. Your machine continuously notifies the server what actions you've taken. The server forwards this to every other player, whose machines proceed to execute your actions. Because the simulation runs in a deterministic fashion, everyone's game is in the same state. Furthermore, the game moves forward in lockstep, meaning no one gets ahead of anyone else. We'll talk about this architecture more when we discuss performance, observer mode, desyncs, and cheating, but for now the basics are all we need. Because each player is executing every action in the entire game in a deterministic fashion, it's straightforward to write all this down into a single file. You could then feed this file into your game engine and ask it to resimulate all of the steps. In other words, play a replay. The takeaway is that a replay system is practically baked into a real-time strategy game's engine. Just by using lockstep simulation, the game is already 90% of the way there. All it needs to do is add reliable recording. If you look at older real-time strategy games, most of them did precisely this. Resimulate the game with a few convenience features like fast mode and a broken camera lock. By contrast, StarCraft II seriously takes things to the next level. Its replay system is really something to behold. Replays in StarCraft II are formatted using the MPQ format, named after its creator. MPQ is short for Mopac, or Mike O'Brien Pack. The format was used in Warcraft 3 as well, and today it's actually deprecated. New Blizzard games will use a new format called CASC, but this happened years after StarCraft II came out, so our replays are still using MPQ. Blizzard offers an open source replay parser called S2 Protocol, which both natively understands MPQ and processes replay events into an easy to understand format. Blizzard doesn't have to offer this software. I'm sure it's been done before, but personally I'm not aware of any other company supporting their replay format in such a public and active way. The code repository is updated after every single patch, and it makes developing replay tools substantially easier. When I put together some code to analyze time to first action among professional players, I made heavy use of S2 Protocol. This meant I could complete the entire project in just a few hours, instead of spending weeks making heads or tails of the replay format. The data within replays is also pretty interesting. One of the things you notice is the large number of camera update events. These signify when and where a player moves their camera. The way the simulation executes on your machine, these events don't actually need to be recorded. As far as I know, they don't affect the game state, and therefore don't need to be sent over the network. Because performance is so critical, most older real-time strategy games didn't bother recording very many camera events, rendering their camera lock feature almost useless. StarCraft II is unique in that it records them generously. To be fair, it does drop a lot. You can see this for yourself by comparing camera lock of a streamer's replays against the live stream version. But it keeps enough such that you can reasonably tell where a player was looking at any given time, and it's sufficient for running the types of camera-focused analysis I mentioned earlier. This might seem like a trivial detail, but I'll reiterate that this is all optional. Blizzard's engineering staff had no real incentive to record a large number of camera events. In fact, they had a lot of incentive not to do so because of the performance implications. But they made it work anyway, presumably because they wanted the user experience to be as good as possible, even if the number of users who would actually notice is a small minority. The same could be said about most of the high-level features in the replay viewer itself. Everything in the top left drop-down menu, the ability to rewind, and collaborative watching are convenience features that make the replay viewing experience just a tiny bit better. I mentioned earlier that 80% of players don't move on to the multiplayer experience. Of the 20% who do, how many do you think make active use of all the different features found in the replay viewer? Only Blizzard has the data, but personally I'd guess it's very small, and they almost certainly would have guessed that this would be the case prior to release. Despite all that, they built it anyway. Stuff like this is one of the reasons it's difficult for a hardcore player like me to stop playing StarCraft II. The user experience is so high quality, almost inexplicably so, that playing anything else feels like an immediate downgrade. Now that we've practiced our build and watched a few replays, let's see how it plays out in a real game. What's interesting about a prepared build is that it's still very difficult to perfectly execute. A few videos back, I compared myself and a Korean professional, Innovation, executing precisely the same build. Even I was shocked at the size of the gap. By the middle of the game, he had 33% more supply than I did. StarCraft II's approach to macro management is actually pretty unique in the real-time strategy genre. It rewards strong mechanics while simultaneously downplaying explicit economic styles. You can piece together Blizzard's philosophy by looking at developer interviews. Here's a particularly interesting quote from the game's director, Dustin Browder, back in 2009. In the interview, Mr. Browder was asked how the matchmaking system would function upon the game's release. Here's what he had to say. So first of all, we are going to have it matching you on maps that are anti-rush maps so that you can sort of get your feet wet and learn the game a little bit better. That isn't as fun ultimately, because the game is a lot more fun when you have to choose between attacking and defending. What's interesting about this quote is the choice between defending and attacking. Traditionally, I think about real-time strategy games as featuring three distinct playstyles: aggressive and rush-based, economic and macro-oriented, and defensive and cost-efficient. All three sit on a spectrum, which I personally envision as something of a triangle. By contrast, Mr. Browder only discusses the first and the last. To understand the implications of this, let me explain how the three playstyles interact with each other. The hallmark of playing economically is expanding faster than your opponent, both horizontally and vertically. Sprawling across the map is explicitly rewarded. Brood War did this through mining efficiency, whereas Age of Empires did it through literal physical limits on resource gathering per unit of land. This style is weak against aggression because it spreads itself thin. However, it's very strong against defensive styles. The relatively stronger economy enables cost-inefficient trades, allowing the economic player to constantly attack someone who's turtling. You can think of this a bit like rock, paper, scissors, but when it's properly designed, it works more like a spectrum. Every player has their own preferred approach, but they move toward one of the other two styles depending on how the game is going and the information they have about their opponent. It's interesting and very dynamic. I'd argue that StarCraft II's early game works in a very similar way. There's a wide range of viable openers, from highly economic to highly aggressive. Players need to scout carefully and rely on time-tested game sense to determine the degree to which their opponent is committing to one style or another. If they play too defensively against a greedy build, they'll fall behind economically. Too economic against an all-in, and they'll never make it into the mid-game. Too aggressive against a turtley style, and they'll just get wiped out. Things change once you get into the mid-game and start hitting the game's economic soft cap. Bases in StarCraft II feature perfect mining efficiency all the way up to 16 workers. This means 50 or 60 workers on 3 bases will mine just as much as 50 or 60 workers on 6 or 7 bases, a big difference from Brood War as well as other older real-time strategy games. This means Sprawl has fewer explicit advantages, it still has all the disadvantages of spreading yourself thin. Furthermore, mining more than 3 bases simultaneously is supply inefficient, so players rarely if ever do that. This is what people mean when they say soft cap. You're not directly forbidden from saturating more than 3 bases simultaneously, but there's no advantage in doing so. One of the things you'll notice about the defensive macro build that I'm executing here is that I'm not economically behind my opponent, even though I am essentially turtling. In other words, my build is economically focused, and defensive, and cost efficient. It's all three simultaneously. There really isn't an explicit economic playstyle beyond the early game. If you read more interviews, the removal of this economic playstyle comes across as very intentional. Here's Mr. Browder again, this time discussing the design of Vespene geysers. Oh dear, we are thinking about how to modify the geysers since forever. We want you to have to manage your economy more. But then, micro-experts would collect by far more resources, and would produce only very mighty units like carriers and archons. That would also be unfair. In addition, the constant geyser checking would become annoying very quickly. We want to reward the players, not annoy them. Streamlining the economic mechanics and pushing the game toward an attack versus defend paradigm pairs nicely with other design changes in the game. In the same interview, Mr. Browder was asked about the biggest difference with StarCraft I. Above all, mobility. Thanks to the new devices of transportation, all factions are more flexible and more mobile. Mobility, to me at least, comes across as a very military-focused feature. It feels like the intent was to streamline and downplay economic management in favor of a stronger military focus. StarCraft II is not unique in this regard. Many real-time strategy franchises moved in this direction during the mid-2000s. What's interesting to me is how the game evolved over the subsequent decade. One of the principal goals of Legacy was creating action and enabling harassment, preventing players from turtling to max supply and then having a single massive engagement. I'd argue that this deathball problem is a result of the economy design and the streamlined micromanagement, but then again hindsight is 20/20. Whatever the reason, the designers wanted to make turtling less viable. The way Blizzard went about doing this is fascinating. Rather than bringing back economic playstyles, they focused on military and tried to create more viable engagements for attackers. They added a number of new harassment options and forced players to expand faster. This made it harder and harder for a defensive macro player to win games without genuinely outplaying their opponent, simply because there's so many aggressive options and potential for harassment that now need to be defended properly. One of the key criticisms that Legacy has faced as a result is that it places too much emphasis on killing workers and attacking. But I think it'd be better to view this from the perspective of economy design, not military. In other words, players don't harass and play super aggressively because the game's military design encourages them to do so. Rather, the economy design confers a ton of advantages to defensive players, so the rest of the game's design responds by creating counters to it. Alrighty, this feels like a good place to cut episode 1. Next time we'll be playing some team games and talking about gimmicks and cheeses. Thanks for watching! If you enjoyed this video, I'd love it if you followed me here and on Twitter and Facebook to receive regular content updates. The relevant links are in the description below. All the best, and see you next time.